All right, how are you all? Have a good weekend. Did it go too fast? Of course it did. So, how's homework number 3 going? Did anybody make a little bit of progress on that? A little bit. Anybody have any questions about it? So here's the good news. Hold on, something really weird is going on my computer. So here's the good news. So I have a meeting this afternoon, and so we won't have class, right? I won't get into what the meeting is. But anyway, so we're not going to have class this afternoon. So that's the good news. So you're going to actually have a little bit of more time to work on your homework number 3. So yeah, if you want to meet with me about it, you can send me an email. We could set up a Zoom appointment, but we'll also have some time tomorrow morning to talk about homework number 3, and then also we talk about your exam on Wednesday, okay? So this morning we're just talking about chapter 14 on basically the determinants of the money supply, okay? And I'll also tell you that this will be the last of the material that's on the exam on Wednesday, okay? So today's lecture will be on the exam, but then this is kind of the end of the material for the exam on Wednesday. So you can also spend this afternoon preparing for the exam a little bit. And once again, I'll make sure that we have some time tomorrow at some point to go over the exam to review it. I'll just say to those of you who are getting a head start on studying the exam, the setup of the exam is pretty much the same as the first exam, right? So there's going to be a mixture of short problems and short answers, and then I'm going to give you a 20-point current event essay again. And once again, the second exam is really going to be focused on the material since the first exam, but that doesn't mean that stuff on the first exam won't show up again. But I mean, the focus is on what we've talked about basically since the stock market. So really, the second exam is about banks, right? And a little bit about monetary policy, but mainly about banks. So, okay. So anyway, without further ado, let's jump in here and talk about the determinants of the money supply. So on Friday, we talked about the Fed and the setup of the Fed. By the way, I apologize to you guys all on Zoom. Something really weird is going on with my computer. It keeps on changing. I don't know if you're seeing this, but it's changing my camera, and weird things are happening. So I don't know if something weird happens, take off your mute and let me know, because I don't know what is going on with my computer today. But anyway, unusual things are going on. All right. So on Friday, we talked about the Fed. Talked about what the Fed is and a little bit of the history and some of the responsibilities of the Fed. Today and tomorrow, we want to talk more into the details of exactly what the Fed does, right? The details of how monetary policy works. So what determines the money supply? How does the Fed control the money supply? Right? These are a couple, really, the 2 big questions for the next couple of days as we try to understand how the Fed does this. Remember that we are defining the money supply as M1. Okay, and what is M1 again? Currency and right, demand deposits. Any deposit that you can immediately withdraw your money from. So not all checking accounts fall into this category, and that's why we want to call them demand deposits, right? But anything that you can take your money out immediately, this is going to be what M1 is. So you'll notice here that to understand M1, you have to understand the central bank, right? Because the central bank is going to play a big role in determining what currency is. But you're also going to know we have to understand banks to understand M1, because banks issue demand deposits. And so understanding this, you know, I think this is a theme of what we talked about last week and we talked about this week. You can't understand banks without understanding the central bank. And you can't understand central banks and the money supply without understanding banks, right? They really are closely related. So let's talk here about the Fed's balance sheet. Okay. If we looked at the Fed's balance sheet, and just like any bank, the Fed has a balance sheet, what would it look like? Well, they've got assets and they have liabilities. Okay. So the liabilities are the sources of funds and the assets are the uses of funds. What's the Fed's sources of funds? Well, currency. Currency and circulation. You can think of currency as just an IOU, but it's the best kind of IOU. In that, does the Fed ever have to pay it back? No, it's an IOU that has an essentially infinite life, right? So essentially one way that the Fed can raise money is they can just print up currency, right? That's the beauty of being in the Fed. And the other is they can create bank reserves. The Fed can just create money by putting more reserves in the banks. And as we're going to talk about, there's really a couple of ways the Fed could do this. One is they can print up money and give it to the bank. But the more realistic way that the Fed does it is they just go into a bank's account and they just give them reserves. And where do these reserves come from? Thin air, right? That's the nice thing about being the Fed. So these are the two liabilities of the banks, right? And these two things we call the monetary base. Currency plus total reserves. And as we're going to talk about in a minute, this is really the portion of the money supply that the Fed controls. Currency plus total reserves, the part of the money supply that the Fed really controls. Now, what assets does the Fed have? Well, the Fed primarily has two big types of assets. Securities, right? They buy securities. And typically, what does the Fed buy when they conduct open market operations? What kind of securities does the Fed buy during open market operations? Bonds, what kind? T-bills, right? Typically, this is T-bills. But recently, the Fed has been involved in buying a lot of different kinds of assets, right? So from the 2008 crisis, they conducted quantitative easing in which they bought mortgage-backed securities and T-bonds. And during the COVID crisis, the Fed has bought a lot of different sorts of assets, such as commercial paper. And even the Fed has worked to help provide, to buy other sources of debt. So securities, right? Securities, typically T-bills, but recently the Fed has done different kinds of things. right? That's the big one. And then the other one is loans. Loans to financial institutions. Discount. We should actually call these discount loans. Okay, so already we get to see one of the big themes here. That M1 is currency plus demand deposits. The monetary base is currency plus total reserves. The Fed controls this, but they do not control this. The Fed does not control the money supply directly. Now, that's not to say that the Fed doesn't have a lot of influence over the money supply, and we'll talk about how this works. But the Fed only really controls part of the money supply, and we call that part of the money supply the monetary base. Okay? So, we'll come back and talk about this again and again, but you can't act like the Fed has perfect control over the money supply because they don't. Banks also play a role in this. So how does the Fed go about changing the monetary base? What happens if the Fed decides they want to increase the monetary base in an effort to try to increase the money supply? Well, the most obvious way, the traditional way they do it, is through open market operations. This is when they buy and sell treasury bills. Okay, so let's think about an example here. Okay, let's say that the Fed buys $100 million in T-bills. And so let's think about the balance sheet here that happens to the Fed. And then also think about what happens to the bank that they buy these T-bills from. Okay, so the Fed buys $100 million in T-bills. So how this process works, we'll talk about this a little bit later, is basically at 11:10 every morning, the Fed conducts its open market operation. So 11:10 Monday through Friday, the Fed conducts an open market operation. And what really happens is economists at the Fed decide what they're going to do, and they just send out a bid. And they'll say, today the Fed wants to buy $100 million in T-bills. And banks will send them back some bids. And the Fed will take the best bids and add them up to get the $100 million. And then they hit execute, and the transaction takes place. Okay? So, for the Fed, what happens when they buy these $100 million? What's the asset they get? The T-bills, right? This is a plus 100 million in securities. What's the liability? Well, how does the Fed pay for these? They put it, right. Now, we don't know for sure, okay? It could be, it's possible, right? Put these two close together. It's possible that the bank could want it in currency. But most likely, they just want it in reserves, right? So we don't know for sure. It depends upon how the bank wants it. The Fed could give them reserves and the bank just pull all those reserves out and put it in currency. It's unlikely, but it's possible. What's happened to the monetary base here? What's happened to the monetary base? It's increased by 100 million. Right now, open market purchase of $100 million increases the monetary base by 100 million. And then what happens over here in the banking system? Well, what do the banks get now? They either get either $100 million in currency or $100 million in reserves. But what's the other part of their balance sheet that gets affected? They get reserves, but what did they give up? Securities. What happened to the assets and liabilities of this bank? There's no net change, right? All the bank has done is traded one asset for another. What has changed is that there's more liquidity in the system, right? We've essentially traded a more liquid asset for a less liquid asset. And in some ways, you think about that's really what the Fed is doing here when they conduct open market operations. They're putting more liquid assets into the financial system. Okay, but I do want to make this point. Does the Fed make banks richer? No, they've just changed the allocation of assets. Now, has the Fed become richer? Well, yeah, in some sense, right? They've expanded the size of their balance sheet. Their balance sheet got bigger by $100 million. The Fed can basically, the Fed's balance sheet is like an accordion, a very big accordion, right? They can stretch that thing out or contract it as they want, right? That's really the beauty, the power, that's where the power of the Fed comes from, is that the Fed can expand assets or cut assets kind of at will in many ways, much more so than a bank, right? So banks, their balance sheet's not changing, just the composition of the balance sheet changes when they do this. One thing though that I want to emphasize is, while the monetary base changes by $100 million, the Fed doesn't control how much of that is in currency and how much of that is in reserves, right? We just don't know. You just don't know how much of that is in currency and how much of that is in total reserves. What happens if the Fed conducts a $100 million open market sale? How's an open market sale look different? Well, really a sale, you just kind of replace all the negatives with positives and the positives with negatives, right? It's going to reduce the monetary base by 100 million. And it's going to increase securities by 100 million, but reduce reserves. And so the banking system gets less liquid. So a sale is basically reducing the liquidity of the banking system, and open market purchase increases. What happens if you write your roommate a check? What happens to the money supply? Nothing, right? Nothing. Only the Fed can do this because, once again, they're creating new reserves or new currency. The key here is that it has to be new. If you just write your roommate a check, that's just money from one account to another account. It's not changing the liquidity of the banking system. It's not changing the amount of assets in the banking system. You're just moving it from one person to the next. So the key here is that the Fed can change the amount of assets, right? They can change the amount of assets and the amount of liabilities. So this is typically the way that the Fed controls the monetary base, right? Through purchasing T-bills. But as we will talk about a little bit today and into tomorrow, it doesn't have to be T-bills, right? The Fed can actually purchase any number of things. The Fed could get on eBay and purchase Star Wars action figures if they want, right? I mean, well, I don't know if that's legal, but in theory, they could purchase a whole bunch of different assets. And that's one of the things that the Fed's been doing by purchasing things like commercial paper, right? They're trying to improve the liquidity, not just of banks, but of markets, right? When the Fed got involved in buying mortgage-backed securities and T-bonds, once again, they're trying to improve the liquidity of markets, right? Not just of banks, but of markets. But in many ways, it changes balance sheets in just the same way, right? Regardless of what the securities are that you hold, the Fed is changing the monetary base and they're changing the money supply. There's one other way that the Fed could change the monetary base. This is really somewhat reserved for emergencies. Because as we're going to talk about, the Fed really doesn't do too much of this. But the Fed could also change the monetary base by providing discount loans. So let's say that the Fed created a $100 million discount loan. Okay, so once again, let's think about what happens to the Fed's balance sheet. And let's then think about what happens to the banking system's balance sheet. Okay, so what happens to the Fed? Well, once again, they create a liability here, right? They're going to give the bank either $100 million in currency or $100 million in reserves. The Fed doesn't control the breakdown between these. What's the asset that's created? Well, now it's not a security, it's a loan, right? That loan is an asset. So this is the second kind of asset that the Fed can create. So notice really the Fed creates two, or can hold two different types of assets. Those are really the two ways that the Fed can change the monetary base. What happens to the banking system? Well, now the banks get either $100 million in currency or $100 million in loans. I'm sorry, or reserves, sorry. But there is a liability created. And that liability is a loan to the Fed. Right? That's something that the bank is going to owe. They have to pay back the Fed. So to just kind of summarize here, the part of the money supply that the Fed controls is this monetary base, right? That's what they control. They can control it really in two ways. Open market operations, meaning buying and selling securities, or through discount loans. But here's a third thing. The Fed controls the monetary base, but do they control the breakdown between C and TR? No, they can't determine how it's broken down. So in other words, the Fed really doesn't have perfect control over the amount of currency, and it doesn't have perfect control over the total reserves, but it does have control over the two of them summed up together. Okay, and that might seem like, well, who really cares? But as we're going to talk about, that's important, right? That's important to understand that the Fed doesn't really control the breakdown between currency and reserves, and that makes that creates some uncertainty for the Fed, right, in ways that we talk about here in a few minutes. So that's how the Fed changes the monetary base. Now, the next question is, how do changes in the monetary base impact the money supply? How do changes in the monetary base lead to changes in M1? So you might remember from principles, I don't know how Professor Faruqi talks about this, for those who had Professor Faruqi, but you know, if you had me, I talked about this stupid example of the Golden Fed helicopter, right? And the Fed puts $100 million up in a Golden Fed helicopter, and the Fed flies around, and it flies over Mount Vernon, and it just pushes all the money out, and the money comes floating down the campus, okay? And so let's make a couple assumptions about what people do with that money. Instead of making it 100 million, let's just make it a more reasonable $100. Right? The Fed creates $100. Let's assume that the required reserve ratio, or your book uses little r, is 10%. Let's assume that the public doesn't change their currency holdings and that banks hold no excess reserves. Okay, so $100 comes down. President Brand picks it up. He's like, man, I've been looking to get that new Marilyn Manson album. He goes buys 10 copies of it, all right? He buys it at Walmart. What does Walmart do with that $100 at the end of the day? Well, they deposit it, right? They deposit it. And so this $100 that's created ends up in the banking system. And so what does Bank One get? They get $100 of reserves and $100 of deposits, right? The deposits are a liability for them because they have to pay that back. It's a source of funds. And the uses is that now they have $100 in reserves. Good for them. However, is Bank One happy? No, because now they have this money sitting in their vault, but what's it not doing for them? It's not earning them interest, right? To get them to, in order to earn interest to make money, they have to lend this out. Now, can they lend out all $100 of this? No, because they have to follow the required reserve ratio, right? Remember, the required reserve ratio is the percent of deposits that you have to keep required at the Fed, right? So how much of this money can this bank lend out? They can lend out, what'd you say, Natalie? 90, right? Really, when we think about this, we really have to think about this as $90 of excess reserves and $10 of required reserves. Okay? $90 of excess reserves, $10 of required reserves. The required reserves, they send to the Fed. It's held on an account for them at the Fed. What does the bank want to do? As Natalie says, what they want to do is over time, they want to turn this $90 in excess reserves into $90 of loans. So that money gets lent out. Let's say it gets lent out to somebody who wants to build a house. So they borrow the money from the bank. When it comes time to pay the contractor, they give the contractor 90 bucks. What does the contractor do with the money? Deposits it, right? And so this is going to eventually end up in Bank Two. And obviously, this is a bit of a fiction. It's not going to end up all in one bank, right? But you kind of get the picture here. So how much gets deposited in Bank Two? The $90 loan. So now this bank has $90 in deposits, right? Plus 90 in deposits. And now it has plus 90 in total reserves. How much can this bank lend out? 81, right? So in other words, of this $90, $9 is required reserves, and 81 is excess reserves. And so over time, what does the bank want to do? They want to turn this into $81 of loans. That loans goes to somebody who wants to buy a new car. Person buys a car at an auto dealer. The auto dealer deposits the money. That creates $81 in deposits and $81 in total reserves. Of that $81, how much is required reserves? $8.10 are required, and they go to the Fed. And how much of it is excess? $72.90. What does the bank do with this? They want to turn it into $72.90 of loans. And I'm not going to keep on going on and on and on. All right. What's the change in the monetary base? How much did the Fed change the monetary base by? 100. What's the change in the money supply? It's the change in currency plus the change in demand deposits. How much did currency and deposits change? 100 plus 90 plus 7290. Right? In other words, the change in M1 is much bigger than the change in the monetary base. The change in M1 is bigger than the monetary base. Or another way you can think about it is the change in M1 is equal to little m times the change in the monetary base, where the little m here is what we call the money multiplier. And it's a number greater than 1. So however much you change the monetary base, you're going to get a bigger change in the money supply. And so when the Fed changes the monetary base, they know they're going to change the money supply by more than that. How much more? Well, that depends upon how big is the money multiplier, right? That depends upon how big the money multiplier is. So the Fed's got a lot of control, right? And not a lot of control, a lot of power, right? By changing the monetary base a little bit, they have the potential to change the money supply a lot. So the next question for us is, how big is this money multiplier? And what determines the money multiplier? Okay, what determines the size of the money multiplier? Okay, just what you've all wanted, a little bit of algebra, okay? So we can actually derive this. It's really not complicated. The algebra here is not complicated. It's simple 8th grade stuff, right? It looks a little complicated because there's a lot of little definitions here, but it's actually pretty simple to derive this. So particularly if we make a couple of assumptions. So we're going to assume that currency assume that currency expands at the rate of deposits. In other words, what we're going to call little c is equal to big C divided by D. And we're going to assume that's a constant. We'll call that the currency to deposit ratio. The currency to deposit ratio is constant. We're also going to assume the same thing about excess reserves. okay? So we're just going to assume that these two things expand. They're constants. We can treat them as constants. Okay. Once we have that, then it's just a matter of using the definitions we already have. The monetary base is equal to C plus TR. And M1 is equal to C plus D. What are total reserves? They're equal to total reserves are equal to excess reserves plus required reserves. And then finally, required reserves are equal to the required reserve ratio times the amount of deposits. Okay, so these are all definitions that we've already talked about. Okay, so everybody kind of with me here. So now it's just algebra, right? Now it's just how can we rework these definitions to put this in a way that we can see how big the multiplier is. So let's do it. Plug equation 4 into equation 3 for the required reserve ratio, and we can get equation 5 here. And then plug equation 5 into equation 1 for total reserves, and we can get equation 6. Okay, let's simplify equation 6. Okay. What is big C? Well, what I really want to do is I want to put this, I want to rewrite this in terms of this currency to deposit ratio, right? And the excess reserve to deposit ratio. I want to really include these in here. So how can I do that? Well, this stays the same. What's big C here? Big C is little c is little c times d. And right? So big C is just little c times d based on our definition. And big ER is little e times d. Okay, so I've just simplified, I've just rewritten this. And then we can simplify this one more time. And we can write it like this. So I'm just putting this in terms of these ratios. And then one final transformation is now let's solve this for D. And we can write it like this. Okay, set equation 9 to the side for a second. Let's go up to equation 2. Because we haven't, you notice the one equation we haven't used here is equation number 2, our definition of the money supply. So let's rewrite equation 2, once again, in terms of these ratios. We'll call this equation 10. What is big C? It's little c times D plus D. Or it's 1 plus C times D. All right, and now we're almost there. Because now what can we do? We solve for D over there. Let's plug it in for D here. And what do we get? Ta-da! So remember all the way back, I should have left this up here. But remember we said that you can think about the money multiplier as M1 is equal to the money multiplier times the monetary base, right? So what have we solved for over here? M1 is equal to the monetary base times this in brackets. So what is this in brackets? The money multiplier. That's the money multiplier. Remember, these are the little c's. So that's a little c of the currency to deposit ratio, the required reserve ratio, and the excess reserve ratio. Those are the 3 things that determine how big the money multiplier is, right? So the money multiplier is basically based on 3 things here. It's based on the required reserve ratio, the currency to reserve ratio, and the excess reserve ratio. So first, let's just do a simple example of calculating this. And here's a numerical example that is somewhat realistic, right? Somewhat realistic. Let's say that the required reserve ratio is 10%. As we will talk about later, in the real world, the required reserve ratio is not a simple number, but 10% is a pretty good average, right? Pretty good average. Currency in circulation is about 600 billion. Checkable deposits is about 1,000 billion, about $1 trillion. And excess reserves, let's just say they're about 1 billion. So what's the money supply? What's M1? What's M1 again? 1,600 billion, or 1.6 trillion, right? C plus D. What's little c? The currency to deposit ratio. .6. What's little e? The excess reserve, the deposit ratio. One over 1,000, or 0.001. It's very small, right? And then what's the multiplier? One plus C divided by the required reserve ratio plus the currency to reserve ratio. Anybody got a calculator? It's 1.6 divided by 0.701. So it's going to be 2.8, yeah. 2.28, right. So in other words, if the Fed changes the monetary base by 100 million, how much will the money supply change by? 228 million. Assuming that these ratios are the same, and assuming that those assumptions hold, right? That basically assuming that these ratios stay constant, the Fed, whenever they change the monetary base by 1, they'll change the money supply by 2.1 times that. Let's talk about this. What determines Let's talk about this. What determines the multiplier exactly? The required reserve ratio. When the required reserve ratio goes up, what happens to the multiplier? It goes down. Does that make sense? Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because what happens if the Fed makes banks hold more required reserves? Then less money gets lent out, and so you get a smaller multiplier process, right? So if the Fed can increase required reserves, they reduce the multiplier. So the Fed can control, the Fed influences the size of this multiplier. Or the Fed has the power to influence the size of this multiplier. And this would be the way. But very importantly, the other two things that impact the multiplier, the Fed doesn't control. One of them is the currency to reserve ratio. What happens if the public holds more currency? The multiplier goes down, right? So remember what the multiplier is. So notice that C is in both the numerator and the denominator, but this is 1 up here, and this is going to be a number, these are numbers that are going to be less than 1. So C has a proportionally bigger effect on the denominator than it does on the numerator. So when C goes up, the multiplier goes down. If you think about this, this makes sense. Because what happens if people hold more currency? Then less money is being deposited in the bank, and if less money is deposited in the bank, there's going to be less of a multiplier process, right? Where the money gets lent out and becomes reserves, which become more lending, which become reserves, right? So it makes sense that higher currency to reserve firms, I say currency to reserve, I mean currency to deposit ratio. That higher currency to deposit ratio would reduce the multiplier. And then finally, excess reserve. What happens if this goes up? Well, once again, if banks are holding more excess reserves, then the multiplier goes down. Because if they're holding more excess reserves, what are banks not doing? They're not lending it out. So that gets to one of the readings that you have for today, right? What's the Fed begun to do for these excess reserves that banks hold?
Paying interest on them.
Paying interest on them. And so what has that incentivized banks to do? Hold more excess reserves. What impact does that have on the multiplier? It's lowered it. Why would the Fed want a lower multiplier? We'll talk about this tomorrow. But the main art, to understand why the Fed is doing this, or at least their rationale, the Fed doesn't control these two things. But the Fed thinks that they have better control if they pay interest rates on excess reserves. So in some sense, what I'm saying is the Fed doesn't really care whether the multiplier is high or low. They just want to know what it is, right? Because that gives them more control over the money supply. So the Fed has decided that by paying interest rates, that gives them more control over this multiplier, right? There's also, as we're going to talk about tomorrow, just this argument that it's not fair to banks for them to be depositing money at the Fed and not getting any interest on it, right? And so I think there's also just an efficiency. The Fed has been worried that banks are purposely not putting money at the Fed because they put money elsewhere, including out of the country, to get interest rates. And the Fed would like more of that money to be in the country where they can keep an eye on it, right? So this is really kind of what the Fed's been doing. But once again, the return to a big theme here. The Fed does not have perfect control over the money supply. This is something the Fed struggles with. They have control over the monetary base, right? They control that, but they do not control this, the multiplier. They can influence the multiplier, but they don't have perfect control. So if you think about, how do you have to think about how the Fed controls the money supply? Some of you heard me use this analogy before, but the Fed really controls the money supply like I control my dog when we go for a walk, right? I got my dog on a leash, but it's a pretty long leash, and my dog is not particularly well behaved, right? So as we walk, where is my dog? all over the place, right? At any moment, my dog could be veering to the left or veering to the right. But ultimately, who determines where we go in the long run? I do, right? Because I can yank her back into place. And that's essentially how the Fed behaves with the money supply. On any day to day, week to week, even month to month, the money supply can be all over the place. And then what the Fed tries to do is it tries to yank it back in place, right? Tries to yank it back either through changing the monetary base in ways we talked about, or by trying to get better control over the money multiplier, right? Trying to get better control over the money multiplier. But yeah, listen, there have been some huge mistakes by the Federal Reserve in the past of just not really being able to effectively control the money supply over short periods of time. So let's talk about a couple of examples here. Look at a little bit of data. Okay. This is so weird. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, here we can see during the 2007, 2008 crisis, right? Look at what the Fed did to the monetary base. The Fed dramatically increased the monetary base. But what happened to the money supply? It went up a little bit, but not nearly as dramatically. What does that tell you happened to the money multiplier? It went down, right? The money multiplier dropped a lot. Why? Well, think about our three things. What do you think happened to the three determinants of the money multiplier during the 2008 financial crisis? First off, what happened to currency to reserve ratio, currency to deposit ratio? What do you think increased? Why do you think it increased? Exactly, fear, right? When people get scared, they pull their money out of the bank. And so that clearly happened where currency holdings went up. What happened to excess reserves that banks held? Increased, in part because the Fed started paying interest, but in part because banks were scared to lend, right? Banks are scared to lend. And so you saw this big increase, particularly in excess reserve, that dramatically reduced the money multiplier. So I remember, this is why you have to be an informed economist to understand these things. I remember in 2008, many people saying, oh my God, we're going to have hyperinflation. Look at what the Fed's doing in open market operations. They're just buying money left and right. We're going to have a hyperinflation. But of course, that's not the only thing that determines the money supply, right? The Fed realized that it could conduct a lot of monetary base purchases, a lot of open market purchases, and not really have much impact on the money supply because of this big decline in the multiplier. And so, yeah, right? Notice here, as the money supply went up, though, the Fed kind of backed off on the monetary base, right? So, once again, the Fed controls the money supply, but there's big lags in it, right? They kind of struggle with this, right? They struggle with this. So despite the big increase of many critics, we didn't see that. And why did the monetary base go down? Well, here we can see this exactly. This is 2008. Notice actually the currency ratio. Natalie, you said it went up. I would have expected it to go up too. it actually went down a little bit, which is somewhat surprising. But the excess reserve ratio jumped from almost nothing to way up here, right? So this decline in the multiplier was largely driven by this big increase in excess reserves. And as I said, part of it is because the Fed started to pay interest rates. And so part of it is the Fed kind of engineered this themselves and anticipated it, but also it was clearly driven by the fact that banks didn't want to lend money, right? They were scared to lend money. And so one of the things that some economists worry about there is a worry during particularly a financial crisis or periods of economic crisis that central banks could fall into what's called a liquidity trap. And this is the idea that traditional monetary policy actually can lose power during recessions. And there's a couple of reasons why this is true. One is we just talked about this. That the multiplier makes it hard for the Fed to increase M1. Right? When that multiplier begins to drop, it becomes hard for the Fed to really significantly increase M1. The analogy that people often use is the Fed finds itself pushing on a string. Okay, which is, I like that analogy, right? You can push on the string all you want, it's not going to lead to any change, right? You can pull on the string, but you can't push on it. And that's often the trap that the Fed falls into, is that when that multiplier, basically when the Fed conducts an open market purchase and banks just put all the money in the vault and people put the money in their pocket, it's hard to stimulate lending. It's hard to stimulate spending. The other problem is the Fed can only drive down interest rates to zero. There's a floor. Once they've driven interest rates down to zero, there may not be much left. And so this is what we're going to talk about a little bit tomorrow, but more on Thursday, is that when you get to this liquidity trap, which focuses on traditional monetary policy, what the Fed more and more has had to rely on is what we can call non-traditional monetary policy. Big asset purchases to increase market liquidity and reduce risk, such as quantitative easing, right? When the Fed bought mortgage-backed securities in 2008, or today, when the Fed has been buying a lot of commercial paper to try to make sure that these short-term bond markets stay going. The key to this, as I said, is here what the Fed's trying to manage is risk. Not so much interest rates in the money supply, but risk. Trying to assuage market fears. And by giving people some confidence that there's going to be liquidity out there in the system. And so the Fed did this quite dramatically, and we'll come back and, as I said, talk here in the next couple of days more about what exactly the Fed has done. Let me talk about a couple of other options out there. One is negative interest rates. And this has actually been tried by some central banks who have tried to drive interest rates down below zero. Now, here's the question. Why in the world would people keep their money in the bank when the bank pays negative interest rates? Because there's a better option out there for most people. They just hold money. Money will give you a 0% interest rate. That's better than negative, right? So why do people keep money in banks when they have negative interest rates? Security, right? Yes, for us, if there were negative interest rates, we would be like, I'm pulling my $500 out of the bank, screw you guys. That's fine if you have $500. What happens if you have $1 billion? Okay. Now, physically, that becomes a real challenge, right? Physically, what is it? $1 billion in $100 bills is like a complete semi-trailer. What are you going to do with all that money, right? And can you move it into other assets? And maybe you can. Maybe you're worried about the stability of other assets during a financial crisis, right? So many banks have tried this, and this is really kind of an all-out effort to try to increase spending. Right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to save in a world of negative interest rates. So why don't you spend? Honestly, this is a sign of a sick economy. I mean, this is a pretty dramatic measure from a central bank, is to try to drive interest rates negative.
You say increase spending and decrease spending?
I'm sorry, savings. I meant to write savings. Yeah, so this is a sign of a very sick economy. And most central banks, at least the Fed, has been very, very reluctant to do this because they really worry, what's the long-term consequences for the financial system, right? Would this lead to financial disintermediation? We used that word before. Disintermediation, meaning pulling your money out of the financial system. A third idea, and this is the reading that you had today, and this is very much an out of the box. Give everybody a Fed bank account. We think about the Fed as the bank for banks. But could your central bank also be a bank for individual citizens? Possibly. And could the Fed just magically put some money in your account during a recession? Possibly. Possibly, right? How hard is this to administer? Not that hard. Not that hard. You know, one of the interesting things here is you find out the holes in a financial system. You find out really how poorly managed in some ways our government is, right? One of the things that happened with these stimulus checks is that, what was it? Something like 10% of these stimulus checks have gone unclaimed because the government has no way of getting money to people. There's a lot of people out there that are not banked. And so that don't pay taxes or pay taxes irregularly or hiding out of the woods in Montana or whatever. You know, so it's interesting. In India, they've got, you know, over 1 billion people and everybody has a government bank account, right? But we don't have that kind of system. And so, you know, some people have said, well, this is kind of a way not only to help people get money, but this is a way to help the underbanked people, right? People who don't have banking accounts, right? Who use payday loans and these kind of things. That said, there's some dangers of doing this. What are some of the dangers that you read about in the article? Or some of the challenges of the Fed doing this?
People might be asking to switch over to the bank like a privacy that cash gives them.
Right. So some people don't want to be banked on purpose, right? Those people living out in the woods of Montana don't want to be banked on purpose. And they're going to probably have even a bigger problem getting banked with the government bank as opposed to a commercial bank, right? I think the other thing is this is just such a radically different change in what we think of as a central bank, right? And there's always the danger that you don't want to give a central bank more to do than it can do, right? I mean, the Federal Reserve already has a lot on its plate, being the systematic regulator and a central bank for banks. Now we're going to give the Federal Reserve basically a lot of the functions of the US Treasury. In our system of checks and balances, it seems like giving an awful lot of power to a bunch of unelected people, quite honestly, right? It does. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about it, right? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about it. And I know that people at the Fed are thinking about it. A lot of what's happened during the COVID crisis is a step in this direction, right? Where the Fed has essentially been out there guaranteeing loans that banks are making, right? And so we can talk about this. So the Fed says, well, if these people don't pay you back, we'll pay you back. These are for small business. This is basically what are called PPP loans. Okay, that's great. You can kind of see where the Fed's doing this, right? The Fed is trying to, once again, reduce risk and increase lending and try to stimulate the economy. But of course, this is a dramatic expansion of the role of the Fed in government, right? A role of the Fed in our economy. So one famous economist has recently said, I know of no other time that a legislature, and by the way, the legislature, the US Congress gave the Fed this power. The Fed just didn't take this. This is actually granted by the legislature. I know of no other time that a legislature has delegated to a central bank such far-reaching authority to allocate credit, right? So the Fed has been given immense power here to allocate credit in a way that really a central bank has never been given power before. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, the Fed says, sure, let's do it, right? we know that these actions need to be taken, so let's do it. But, you know, on the other hand, boy, this is really giving a lot of power, right, to one institution that's not elected. And it's also getting the Fed more intricately involved in the politics of what happens, right? I mean, if this works out, the Fed probably will get no credit, and if it goes bust, the Fed will probably get all the blame, right? As typically happens in these things. So, yeah, it's unusual times, right? It is unusual times. The role of the Federal Reserve has so greatly expanded here since the 2008 crisis, and it continues to expand. And so, you know, more and more, you have to understand central banking to understand finance, because the power of the Fed is just growing by leaps and bounds. And as somebody who, you know, in graduate school, one of my areas was monetary economics, and I've had an interest in this, and, you know, always been somebody that, you know, I guess believes in the power of central banking to do good. But even for somebody like me, sometimes this gets a little scary, right? That when you know, one institution with our government gets so much power, and then the other, I think also for me, what makes me nervous is not just that the Fed is getting more power, it's that the presidents and Congress seems less capable of doing anything, right? So it's not just the absolute power, it's the relative power, right? That is, as Congress and the presidency seems to be becoming more dysfunctional and less powerful, that the Fed is becoming more powerful, right? And so it's the gap between the two seems to be closing quickly, right? Closing quickly. So anyway, so those are some issues that I'm sure we will come back to and talk about here in the next couple of days. So tomorrow we're going to talk about chapter 15 in Michigan. We will talk about central banking in less developed countries. So I'm going to give you a reading on that. And then I'm going to give you a reading on digitalization over the last few months of the COVID crisis, all right? And you'll do your daily reading on that. So we'll be back here tomorrow morning. Remember, no class this afternoon. Tomorrow morning we'll have class. We'll talk about that. Tomorrow afternoon, we probably will have a shorter class, and we'll finish up our discussion in the morning and talk a little bit about exam number 2, okay? All right, make sure you spend some time working on homework number 3 so that if you have any questions, you can ask, all right? Okay, have a good afternoon.